Japan's Yukio Hatoyama's sudden resignation makes him the fourth prime minister to quit in 4 years. Did he promise too much but deliver too little? Or does it reflect growing political instability in Japan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashim Ahalbarra. Japan is looking for its fifth prime minister in 4 years. Yukio Hatoyama quit office on Wednesday following funding scandals and a broken promise to move an unpopular US military base from a Japanese island.
I have decided to resign this post. I worked hard to relocate the base outside Okinawa, but unfortunately I was not able to do that.
This issue was at the center of his election campaign last year and is often credited to have resulted in his landslide victory. While he failed to move the base off Okinawa, he relocated it to another part of the island. This led to public discontent and growing criticism from his own Democratic Party of Japan, which will now choose a new leader on Friday. Finance Minister Naoto Kan has emerged as the front-runner to become Japan's next Prime Minister. While joining us to discuss the topic in Tokyo, Tomohiko Taniguchi, political analyst and professor at Keio University. In Washington, D.C., Sheila Smith, senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And in London, Sean Curtin, research fellow at the Japanese Institute of Global Communications. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking Mr. Tomohiko Taniguchi. Mr. Tomohiko, I know that pundits now are scrambling to sort out what happened in Japan. Now we have two theories, one which says that this is just a normal sequel in a long tradition of political instability in Japan. On the other hand, we have another theory which stipulates that this is perhaps the beginning of a deeper political crisis in Japan. To which theory do you seem to subscribe most?
Well, a cynic would say after taking office after a long rule of the Conservative Party, whose rule extended for longer than 50 years, this sort of chaotic situation should have been inevitable. But this is more to do with Mr. Hatoyama's individual incapability than any broad picture, any broad situation surrounding Japanese politics.
Sheila, what do you make of this?
Well, I agree. I think it's important, though, that we always start this conversation appreciating the difficulty of the transition underway. Moving from a single-party dominant system into a system of alternating parties in power is bound to cause some disruptions. But I think I would agree with Mr. Taniguchi that Mr. Hatoyama himself did not provide the kind of leadership that the DPJ really needed in this important first year.
Sean, now we have a sense of agreement that perhaps what led to his downfall is basically the fact that he couldn't deliver on the huge promises that he made during the campaign. Is this the case?
Yeah, I think as my two colleagues have said, the basic problem was that being an opposition party, I think that Mr. Hatoyama didn't realise what he could or could not put into practice once he took hold of the rein of powers. But as Professor Taniguchi also mentioned, he wasn't the most dynamic of leaders. In many ways, he was lucky to become leader because the previous leader of the Democratic Party of Japan had to resign, Mr. Ozawa, of a funding scandal. Mr. Hatoyama came in at the last moment to gain the premiership when the opposition won a landslide victory last year. But he hasn't shown decisiveness. In whatever country you're in, people like their leaders to be decisive and have vision. Mr. Hatoyama seemed to, he didn't seem to have any credibility. He couldn't make his mind up, and it was excruciating over this base issue that first of all he said he was going to relocate it, and then he turned around and said he couldn't relocate it, and he seriously damaged the US-Japan relationship in the process. I think another issue that Japanese voters will be thinking about is is the people who end up as Prime Minister suitable? Because Mr. Hatoyama comes from a dynastic family, a brand name. His grandfather was Prime Minister. The previous Prime Minister, who lasted less than a year, his grandfather was also Prime Minister. The Prime Minister before that, Mr. Fukuda's father, was Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister before that, his grandfather was Prime Minister. So people will be asking, are these people, they have the political pedigree but not the political punch to lead the country?
All right. This is somebody who has been credited, or at the beginning, for really willing to change the political establishments in a sense or another, but suddenly he was rocked by scandals. Mr. Tomohiko, was the scandal issue something that could perhaps damage the Democratic Party in the future? Could it recover from this after the departure of the Prime Minister?
Well, financial illegalities, if that means, hit Mr. Hatoyama and Mr. Ozawa, the behind-the-scenes seeker and shaker and mover, very hard. And what was amazing, even more, for the nation was Prime Minister Hatoyama confessed that he had known nothing about the $150,000 equivalent of a donation that he'd been getting from his own mother. So the nation was appalled. The degree of disappointment was deep-rooted, especially because he came into office with a brand of change, just like Barack Obama. So the people in Japan became very much disappointed by the whole fiasco, not just about Okinawa, but about the whole event.
We'll definitely go back and talk about Okinawa in the second part of our show. Sheila, but still, you can't blame somebody for a legacy which has been there for decades. This isn't the man who has installed a culture whereby the political establishment or the political leadership establishes a system of patronage, at the same time rallies the support of the business elite in exchange of favorable policy decisions. Money politics is something which has been in Japan for years and years.
It has, but I do think you can hold him accountable. I think we need to go back to 1993-94, which is the beginning of this process of political change. New laws on campaign financing. This was the moment when Mr. Ozawa, the force behind Mr. Hatoyama, left the Liberal Democratic Party and began this decade or more of kaleidoscopic political realignment in Japan. But that early 1990s moment was all about political reform. That the kinds of patterns of behind the scenes campaign funding, illegalities, the power struggles, the factional leadership, all of that, those habits were supposed to have been reformed and changed. So back in the 90s, there was this idea that Japan needed cleaner politics, it needed more accountable politics, and the party that came to the fore, really representative of that reform agenda, was the Democratic Party of Japan. So for the Democratic Party of Japan, Mr. Hatoyama and Mr. Ozawa, to be so embroiled in these financial scandals, to be suspect of the exact same thing that they had campaigned for a decade, in fact they had built a party around, really undercut the reform agenda and the credibility of the DPJ as the party that really could bring reform to Japanese governance.
Sean, I've read and heard political considerations which led to the political destruction of Hatoyama. However, we're talking about the second largest economy in the world, crippled by deflation, by unemployment, where national debt stands at something like 230% of the country's GDP. Isn't this a factor which has contributed to his unpopularity in Japan?
Well, I think it's a constraining factor because obviously the Democratic Party of Japan came to office making a lot of promises, free toll roads and handing out money. And obviously when the coffers, there's no money in the kitty, it's very difficult to implement these sort of promises. So there's obviously a problem there that the economy is in dire straits, and so they're actually constrained and they can't actually deliver on some of their promises. But to go back to what two of my colleagues have said, I think that the political system itself, people felt that the Democratic Party of Japan was new politics, but we have to remember that Mr. Ozawa and Mr. Hatoyama used to be members of the Liberal Democratic Party. In fact, nearly all the key figures in the Democratic Party of Japan used to be members of the Liberal Democratic Party. So in a way, it isn't really a new politics. It's basically Liberal Democratic Party light, LDP light. It isn't such a change. So we shouldn't be so surprised that the same old money politics has cropped up. And that is the problem, that people were told that it's the end of this money politics. And as Professor Taniguchi mentioned, Mr. Hatoyama's mother gave him millions and millions of yen secretly to his political funds. So it's highly embarrassing for him. Mr. Ozawa was mired in another political funds. But I think that the Japanese public, to go back to a wider question, will still probably give the government, the new government, a second chance. It very much depends on who will become Prime Minister next, which direction the party will take. And the most likely candidate, as you mentioned earlier on, is the current Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Mr. Naoto Kan. And he is a self-made politician. He's not from the Liberal Democratic Party. He doesn't come from a political dynasty. So perhaps he'll offer the Japanese public a new chance. We'll have to see.
All right.
Yes.
Well, in the last 38 years, Junichiro Koizumi is the only Japanese Prime Minister to spend more than 5 years in office. His term ended in 2006. The following 4 years saw 4 men come into and out of office. Shinzo Abe succeeded Koizumi only to leave a year later when his popularity ratings plummeted. He resigned abruptly amid mounting political pressure and deteriorating health. Yasuo Fukuda was man next in office. Like Abe, in a year's time he quit suddenly. He said his reasons were related to the flow of political process. Taro Aso was then elected to succeed him in September 2008, just when the global economic downturn began, leaving Japan in recession. A year into office, Aso lost the general elections, paving the way for Hatoyama, and as we've mentioned before, he was brought down by political funding scandals and his failure to move the US base. Mr. Tomohiko Taniguchi, this is somebody, Hatoyama, who came to power against the backdrop of grandiose hope and goals like breaking loose from the strategic alliance with the United States of America, but telling the Japanese people that I will break loose from this alliance, isn't this some sense of populism, or was it just a sense of naivety? Because by the end of the day, how can you shake a political establishment which has been over there for more than 4 decades?
Well, he, I think, tried to project a sort of image that he was like a postmodern politician in the world. Caring less about national boundaries, caring less about nationalism and so on. But looking around, he finally came to grips with the reality that Japan sits right in a pretty much rosy neighborhood. North Korea is now threatening its southern neighbor and the world. And the Chinese are busy building their arsenal and so on. So he confessed a couple months ago that he knew very little, he had known very little about something called deterrence. And that also was an appalling confession, and many jaws dropped at the time. So I would say more than, I would say naivete on the part of Prime Minister Hatoyama was the cause.
Sheila, the Japanese were carried away by this sense of repositioning or rethinking the position of Japan in the region, but suddenly when it comes to the United States of America and the Defense Pact, it seems that they have changed their mind and said, wait a minute, we still need the Americans. Was this a main factor why the Japanese people realized suddenly that Hatoyama's move could compromise the whole sovereignty or security of Japan?
Well, I think there was a deep concern inside Japan about the impact of Mr. Hatoyama's management of the base issue on the larger U.S.-Japan relationship. Two factors here. I like Mr. Taniguchi's reference to Mr. Hatoyama as a postmodern prime minister. He came into office last fall with this idea of fraternity, that he was reaching out in the brotherhood of nations, and he was going to pursue Japanese diplomacy on that basis. I think he very quickly understood last fall, though, that not only the U.S.-Japan relationship, but his relationship with his neighbors, the diplomacy that he had to engage in was going to need to be much more sophisticated, much more focused and specific and pragmatic. I don't know that he managed to get that kind of texture in his thinking about his own diplomatic goals. With the United States, though, he very early on, of course, ran into this issue of Futama. And the U.S. and Japan have been trying to relocate this base for 13, 14 years now. So it's a very complex, very politically difficult problem. And there's a lot of frustration that has been built up within the bureaucracies of both countries trying to work this problem through. So he ran headlong into this very difficult problem. And to kind of American anxiety and impatience with Japan for not moving the issue forward faster.
Sean, there are reports today that the Americans, in a sense or another, or indirectly contributed to Hatoyama's political demise because they didn't reach out to him, they sort of sidelined him, and they conveyed a message to the Japanese people that be careful with this man, perhaps you might not be safer in the future. What do you think?
Yes, I think that it's very interesting. I think that I wonder what the long-term implications will be of this base issue and for US-Japan relations and also for Japan-China relations, the dynamics between those two sets of relationships. Firstly, because we can see that Japanese prime ministers have to be subservient to US will. Basically, the Obama administration leaned on Hatoyama and he gave in completely. And there's an interesting contrast. The Obama administration has lent on Japan and Israel, and Japan has folded, whereas in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to thrive on concentration and sticking up two fingers to the Obama administration. And how will Japanese people perceive their own role in the world, and the long-term implications when Japanese people digest this and think about the way that their Prime Minister was treated? Was it disrespectful, for instance? I think that in the short term, the next Prime Minister will want to paper over the cracks that exist, and presumably the 2006 Accord will, over the base relocation, will just go on, because it was a very, very painful process to reach. But the other dynamic is this, and this is the significant one. When the Democratic Party won the election last year, in the landslide victory, they changed the dynamics of the China-Japan relationship. Under the Liberal Democratic Party, the relationship with China was very antagonistic because it was felt that they were very insensitive to the way that Chinese feelings over the war, and very disrespectful to Chinese feelings. The Democratic Party has a new relationship, and we've seen the relationship sharply improve. Now, how this will develop in tandem with the antagonism that may develop between the US-Japan relationship will be interesting to see how it plays out long term. So this could have significant long term effect on the regional dynamics.
Mr. Tomohiko, Sean was talking about the new chain of dynamics set by the Democratic Party. Do you think that China now is going to face a major setback because it was hoping to expand its political influence with Hatoyama?
Well, I thought, coming to the China question, I thought when I saw 600 plus members of the DPJ went to Beijing to see Hu Jintao, I wondered if Japan was revisiting its past of tributary suzerain relationship between China and Japan. That relationship lasted extremely short among the Asian peripheral nations. But that said, hedging and engagement would be the continued guideline to lead Japan's relationship with China, just like that's the case for the United States. So to engage China economically, Japan is going to have a robust China policy, and it's going to do a lot to penetrate into Chinese market and to cooperate and work together with China even. But when you look at the military buildup of China, that's very much horrifying, and Japan needs the United States more than ever, I think.
Shall will the next replacement or substitute of Hatoyama be very careful talking about the whole issue of security or defense pact with the Americans, particularly when it comes to the relocation of the military bases in Okinawa?
Right. Let me say two things just to add to my colleagues' comments about, first of all, on the base issue, the agreement that was concluded last week that was so controversial that led to the dissembling of the coalition with the Social Democrats. That agreement is a framework upon which the U.S. and Japanese governments hope to move forward. Now, that framework, of course, depends completely on the agreement of the people of Okinawa. So I think as you look forward here, it's better to see this base issue as a process that will continue to unfold. The governor of Okinawa, the mayor of Nago City, the new leader of the Democratic Party, and indeed the new cabinet that emerges after the upper house election in July, they will continue to have to deal with this Futenma issue. For the U.S.-Japan relationship, however, I think most of us feel that because of the tensions over Futenma and the escalation and the miscommunication and the disjuncture between the conversation between Mr. Hatoyama and the Obama White House, I think many of our policy leaders feel the time has come now for the U.S. and Japan to put a broader-based conversation about the alliance on the table.
All right.
And this was initiated last January between Secretary of State Clinton and Foreign Minister Okada, that we really need an exploratory conversation about the strategic goals, the means, ends kinds of dialogue about how to move this alliance forward into the next decade or more. And the primary focus for Washington as well as Tokyo needs to be to think about how this alliance works within the regional context that the Japan and the United States really ought to focus on.
Okay.
China's rise, instability on the Korean Peninsula, particularly in the recent weeks following the Chonan sinking. Regional crisis management is really something that Japan, South Korea, and Washington ought to be talking more about. So I think you see in Washington, as well as hopefully in Tokyo, a desire to move away from the mechanics of the base issue, although it will continue to be with us, and move the alliance dialogue to a higher level in the bilateral conversation as we move forward.
Okay, Sean, the man has gone, but however, the ideals that he had fought for, particularly during the campaign, are still resonating among the Japanese people, particularly when it comes to sort of freeing the Japan from the sphere of influence of the Americans. Is this something that could definitely backfire in the future?
It's difficult to say. I think he definitely opened a Pandora's box. The previous Liberal Democratic administration had reached a very difficult accord with the United States about the base relocation. But I think that what the Hatoyama administration managed to do was highlight the suffering and the problems that the people of Okinawa have, and this issue, as my colleagues have said, will not go away, and it will be interesting to see how it develops. Obviously, whoever the next Prime Minister is, if it's Mr. Kan, it will be interesting to see how his relationship with the US develops. But I think long term there will have to be some further discussion, because obviously the dynamics in Okinawa have now become so charged that it will be difficult to put the can back on or close the lid on this very difficult issue.
Mr. Tomohiko, the next midterm elections are definitely going to be a test for the popularity of the Democratic Party. Do you think that they stand a strong chance to recover from this political crisis and reposition themselves within the political establishment in Japan as a fresh new party with strong ideals and ideas to implement in the near future?
Well, Prime Minister Hatoyama may have been immature, but the voters in Japan have become mature enough to look at the DPJ and have a diminished expectation about the party. Because of the unraveling of the LDP, the previous ruling party, it's going to be a tough race, but it's going to be a winnable race for the DPJ. And DPJ is going to produce the political leadership. But what's changed over the last couple of months is the nation has become even more realistic about the incapability or the capability, whatever you say, of the DPJ.
A very interesting and complex topic that you can't fairly cover in 30 minutes, but we're running out of time. And thank you very much indeed, Mr. Tomohiko Taniguchi, Sheila Smith and Sean Curtin. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.